I'm not sure whether we'll agree with you or not agree with you, because my last discussion with you, I thought I'm not on the same page. For instance, you had said that the Russians will take over the country and appoint a new president by Friday, but it's not happened. Something new. So you'll have to explain why, what was the variable that you didn't allow for, and this happened. But that doesn't mean that you are not. We don't hold you in very high esteem as a man of learning, as a man dedicated to the subject. So we all want to hear now. Basically, I will begin by just a 5-minute introduction on the subject from my perspective, and then as per your perspective, put it across, and then later on we will have exchange. The two elements of the topic that we announced, one is India's national interest and the other is situation in Ukraine. As far as our national interests are concerned, I will say, broadly speaking, India should work within 4 dimensions. One is that it must defend democracy. Otherwise, what is, if you are with dictatorships and democracies, you can't make a distinction between the two. Then it's very bad for India's image. And I would certainly say, in this particular example, Ukraine was a flourishing democracy. They may have some upheavals. One president had to be driven away by a mob, but still they have elections. And today somebody is being elected who a young person who is now shown himself to be a man of great courage. And I think, therefore, it was our India should have been much more forthcoming. I'm not saying India must underwrite everything the democracy says. The United States is a democracy, but there are so many things they do we don't agree with, and they also don't agree with us. By democracy, of course, we have to disagree. But I would say that all we seem to be doing is evacuation. We did it in Afghanistan, we did it in Iraq, we are now doing it in Ukraine. So we don't seem to have our national interest worked into any kind of policy. It's just save your people who have gone there on their own free will to study and to earn and to work and so on. So I think one of the things I would like to say is that it was in our national interest, in the name of democracy, to have supported, maybe lukewarm, but supported and voted with those who wanted to censure Russia in the United Nations Security Council. And we've got now another chance now at the UN General Assembly, and I hope we revise our stand and support in the Ukraine and for its freedom and its not being bullied by the Russians or anybody else. The second thing is we have to play a clear international role, India, because we are in Quad, which has America in it, and we are also in BRICS. Now, you can't be in both. I don't understand how we can be in both. And maybe Abhijit understands, and because he's got lots of friends in the government also, and so he could perhaps inform us how you can be both. And what is more important, which should we? I mean, if somebody says no, we should be part of BRICS, not Quad, that's a point of view. I mean, I can respect it and I can argue, but we must be critical of the fact that our government doesn't seem have a clear dogma about national interests, and therefore they are flopping everywhere. The Chinese have occupied our land, but we go and meet them. There was a BRICS meeting which we had in India. Of course, it was online, and but Modi appeared with Xi Jinping. Now, the third thing is we should not take a stand where we become isolated, and an unpopular stand. Today, we are isolated. What happened in the Security Council? we abstain. And how many people, how many countries abstain? China, India, and UAE. UAE, of course, you can, whether they are abstain or side with you, it's a small country. But we are on the same side as China. That means China has shown more independence, considering its close proximity to Russia, than India. And India has agonized, and then it has taken a stand of not voting for either side. So I think, put together, I would say that we don't have a national interest based foreign policy in our country today. It's who receives whom, and how they smiled, and how they went out to protocol, or you have a rally in which you say agle baar kisi ki baar or something, whatever. And it's not a well-structured thing. And I would like Abhijit to tell me whether he views the Indian foreign policy today in the same way, as an unstructured, ad hoc set of steps. Then you come into the situation in Ukraine. I hardly need say that a country has been invaded, and by a much stronger country. And the only argument that I have seen them give is that they're going to join in NATO, but they haven't joined. So and the Americans have not taken any. The Americans are not saying Americans are wooing, and these people, Ukraine, is hesitating. No, it's not that. Ukraine is very keen, but the Americans are not so far. Maybe now they will. But the fact is that can't be a reason. All talk about persecution of Russians, all rubbish. To call the president of Ukraine as a Nazi, as idiotic, because he's a Jew, and his father was in the fight against, in the clandestine fight against Hitler in Germany. So, I mean, how can you say all these things, without somebody doing the research and finding out? So not saying you're not doing anything. Now, suddenly, the Russians sent word that they're ready to have talks. The Ukraine government in hiding. They said, no, we don't want to. Then Belarus tried to intervene. And now they are more or less agreed. I don't know whether they're going to go through with this, because there may be other nitty-gritties to be worked out. But at last, if it's the talks will take place, but supposing the talks fail, can Abhijit tell us what should be the scenario and what we should be on lookout for? So finally, all this that has happened, how does it weigh on India-US relations, and how India's China relations, how it's going to be developing in the near future? These are some of the things that we would like to know from you. And then afterwards, we will interact with you. The entire panel that we have will interact with you. Over to you, Abhijit.
Sorry. Thank you, Doctor. So let me start with this one by one. So first is the unstructured foreign policy. On this, I agree with you 100%. The problem has always been the extreme personalization of Indian foreign policy since Nehru's time, and it remains unchanged. So you had people like V.K. Krishna Menon who would keep mouthing off nasty abuses to the Americans, would literally go against the diktat of Nehru and voted for the Russian invasion, the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956, even though he was instructed to oppose it. And Nehru would turn a blind eye because Krishna Menon was his favorite. You've had several episodes like this where policy has been unnecessarily personalized. I.K. Gujral, for example, would just go around making nasty remarks about Britain when there was absolutely no need to. I mean, they hadn't said anything nasty about you. Why would you say anything nasty about them? Etc., etc. I mean, it's such a long litany. The second part of it, of course, is the way our foreign ministry is run. Excruciatingly understaffed. There is no through career training, literally nothing. So you have a very low intake point, and the value addition to the service is next to negligible. So even the analysis that come out of it are extremely well, let's just say they're about the same quality as a JNU PhD. There are, of course, notable exceptions here or there, but those are simply the exceptions that prove the rule. And of course, our beloved Lord and Master, the Prime Minister, seems to love the Foreign Service over all others. So he's kind of waddling in a sea of mediocrity as his pool of advice goes. So there's nothing much we can do about that except to, see it as we call it. Now, that said, in terms of Ukraine, I would say democracy or no democracy, support to Ukraine should be measured in terms of have they supported us in the past. And I think if you go by Ukraine's voting record in the past and their record in general, it has been an extraordinarily abysmal one. Ukraine sold Pakistan lethal weapons like the 320 T-80U tanks. They've supplied them with all kinds of lethal machinery. Russia has also supplied Pakistan, but with non-lethal helicopters and jet engines. Ukraine was one of the first countries to denounce India after the 1998 nuclear tests. They have voted against us 2 or 3 times. They have been regularly signatories to several statements from the special representatives and things like that against India. And mind you, even as we're speaking today, this morning, the Ukrainian permanent representative at the UN issued a threat against Indian students, saying that, if you value the safety of your students, you should be voting for us. And within the last hour, we've been getting reports that Indian students were beaten by Ukrainian border police and forced back, and they're being used as hostages in some form or the other. So I don't think supporting Ukraine should be very high up on our priority list, number one. Second is the question of Ukraine's own record in terms of the sovereignty of other countries. We need to look at what the role they played in Syria, but much more specifically, the role they played in Iraq in the 2003 invasion, which they joined quite happily. And that was a completely illegal invasion, which violated every rule book. In fact, it's as illegal as, in fact, it's the same legal principle. Preventative war is illegal. Preemptive war is legal. George W. Bush dressed up prevention as preemption, and that's exactly what Putin has done with Ukraine. He's dressed up preventing them from joining NATO as preempting them from joining NATO, and he's literally taken something out of something that Ukraine itself had used to join aggression onto another country. So even in terms of Ukraine's own record with other countries, it's been less than stellar. Third, we need to be very clear that at least since 2014, Ukraine has been a less than perfect democracy, which is perfectly fine. No democracy is perfect. But since 2019, when Zelensky took over, he has systematically been putting his opponents in jail. He has been putting newspaper editors in jail. He has been putting on primary, secondary, and tertiary sanctions on anybody who opposes him. And effectively, what he is the fountainhead of a web of extraordinary corruption, which of a whole bunch of oligarchs, and it's not very different from the Pakistani Fauji Foundation mentality out here. Because what happens here with Zelensky is that all the business interests are concentrated to his cronies. He has constantly whittled away the power of the Verkhovna Rada, the parliament, and centralized it to himself. He refuses to implement the agreements that his own government signed. They signed the Minsk agreement saying that one way out of what happened in Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk was to, federalize the structure. His government is committed to it. And yet, what he has been doing is removing powers, much like Modi, and centralizing it all onto himself. And mind you, this was also in opposition to his election promises. If you look at the voting pattern of Ukraine, the east of the Dnieper, which has always been a Russian majority, has tended to vote for a pro-Russian candidate, while the west of the Dnieper has tended to vote for a Ukrainian nationalist. In this election, both banks voted overwhelmingly for Zelensky because he claimed that he was going to heal all these old wounds and he was going to enact federalism, his own election promises, which he's gone back on. Now, going back on election promises is not a sign of bad democracy. In fact, democracies are known for bad election promises, which people regularly go back on. But jailing opponents, jailing journalists, whittling away the powers of parliament is definitely a sign of turning away from a democracy. So these are all the different reasons why we absolutely should not be supporting Ukraine. Plus, of course, the fact that we depend much more on Russia than we ever will on Ukraine. Next, the part of the unstructured foreign policy, like you said, Doctor, the Quad and BRICS, why both? Thankfully, I'm happy to announce we're equally useless in both. We're equally useless in BRICS and we're equally useless in Quad. So Quad is, though they don't claim it's a military alliance, we all know it's a military alliance. The problem, of course, is the other three members, Australia, Japan, and America, their ships can talk to each other seamlessly. They don't even need voice commands. It's all done on computers. It's like pack thinking, like Star Trek cyborgs. What the Queen Bee thinks, all the others know exactly, and they know how to attack. It's like a wolf pack attack tactics. India does not have that systems compatibility. And, in private for the last 10 years, I've been hearing constant complaints about how India refuses to standardize its equipment and, make it intercompatible with the other equipment. So it's really something more of think of our Quad participation more as a Punjabi wedding. It's all about the show and the dhamaka and the bhangra and the barat and things like that than it is about any substance. Because, a great wedding can't ensure, a great barat and a great band in a wedding can't ensure that the marriage itself is going to be successful. So it's like, Punjabi wedding where too much is spent on the barat and not enough is spent on seeing that the bride and groom are compatible. BRICS is a talk shop. I think we've all seen that it's been a talk shop since day one. It's fantastic for the five leaders to come together and make pointless hot air statements. But there's also been a clear warning sign in BRICS that, Russia comes with a position on the first day, and by the third day of every BRICS summit, it's completely mutated and become very similar to the Chinese statement. I think there you're beginning to see very clear divergences between China and Russia on the one hand, and India, Brazil, and South Africa on the other. But in any case, they're all completely incompatible, and they were this entire grouping, which was in my opinion, a very foolish grouping, was invented by some economist. He called it BRIC. And then, everybody decided how wonderful, and they decided they needed African representation. So they added the S at the end and added South Africa to it. But like I said, one grouping is useless, and in the other, we are useless in the grouping. In both cases, essentially, India is useless in the grouping. So this brings me to the next question you asked, Doctor, which is, the isolation that India faces in terms of its decision at the UN Security Council, the legality of the invasion, the Nazi bit, and the future of talks. I don't think, from everything that I'm hearing, even from DC, because the United States came out and made a clear statement saying, look, we don't expect you to vote with us, but we do expect you to use whatever means, resources, and faculties you have with Putin to talk, intercede, and try to bring an end to this. And mind you, most of the people I talk to in Pentagon anyway have a very low opinion of India's diplomatic capabilities anyway. Those same people curiously come on TV every fortnight and say lovely things about India. Sadly, in private conversations, they say exactly the opposite things about India. That, look, we value your diplomatic cooperation as much as we value, say, Mauritius or Seychelles. Nothing more than that. I mean, nobody really cares about the diplomatic stance of an ant. So that, unfortunately, is what's happening out there. There's a huge dichotomy between what Western think tankers see and what it seems to me that their governments see. Because I've also been talking to the French and the Germans, and they're like, we don't even care about what happened. And the Americans are like, look, it's fine. We understand. Now do something constructive. They don't like to create problems. They like solving problems. Unlike our bureaucrats and diplomats, since you know my mother very well, loves putting up obstacles and everything. Unlike the IAS, IFS combined, those guys, they prefer solving mostly. They prefer solving things. As for the legality of the invasion, the problem with the legality of the invasion is, I personally believe it's completely illegal, and technically it is. The problem is that the precedent that the US itself has set in terms of blatantly illegal issues. Number one was the bombing of the Bosnian Serbs because of horrific human rights atrocities. And they said, after everything was sorted out, after the Srebrenica massacre, the bombing started, the Bosnian Serbs were bombed into submission. NATO said, look, you can't become a separate country. You can't join Serbia. You have to remain this conglomerated state, this federalist state. But then when the same thing happens in Kosovo, they go in without a UN resolution under the principle of humanitarian intervention, which is a legal principle, but it isn't an enacted legal principle by the UN. And even assume it is legal. Assume for a minute that it was perfectly legal, that the intervention was legal. Separating it from Serbia and violating Serbia's territorial integrity, I have seen no rule of humanitarian intervention that allowed that to happen. And yet they did it. They also recognized Kosovo, which is what Putin initially did with Donetsk and Lugansk. So, it's highly debatable. Next, of course, was the Iraq invasion, which we've already spoken about. Prevention dressed up as preemption. And the third, and to discuss the third, I have to discuss the slight history, which is that, the Russians now claim that they had verbal assurances, that Gorbachev got verbal assurances that NATO would not expand east. And every time they bring that up, the Americans say, where's the paper? Show us the paper where we ever said we will not expand east. Which brings us to the third point, which is Libya. The UN Security Council resolution on Libya was very clear. It said you will ensure a ceasefire. But that is not what America, France, and Britain did. They did not ensure a ceasefire. They ensured full-fledged regime change. And when the Russians asked them, hey, this is a resolution for ceasefire, not for regime change, they said, well, it was impractical, therefore we had to improvise. And anyway, we had a wink-wink, nudge-nudge agreement. So, your verbal assurances are not verbal assurances. My verbal assurances are cast iron guarantees. Clearly, that can't work. So they have a history of bad diplomatic bad faith. They have a history of violating international laws prolifically, systematically, repeatedly, decade after decade since the end of the Cold War. So even legally, there's a case of equivalence to be made here. As for Zelensky calling him a Nazi, I think it's a bit more complicated than that. He may be a Jew, but I would remind you there were 40 Jewish officers in the Finnish army that served directly under SS command, all of whom were awarded Iron Crosses. Now, they all refused it to a man, because ultimately they were like, I'm a Jew, you're a Nazi, you're killing my people, thank you, I don't want your award. The problem is something very similar out here. Zelensky may be a Jew. His parents may have been executed by the SS. The problem is he heads a coalition which has extreme right-wing elements in it who support, celebrate Stepan Bandera as the head of the nation. Stepan Bandera was a Schutzstaffel, an SS Waffen executioner, who was used by the Nazis as a Jew hunter, so to say, and a Russian hunter, and he would go round them up for transportation to concentration camps or just engage in mass executions. Even more problematic than Stepan Bandera, because you can argue Stepan Bandera is just a symbol and it's some way of connecting it to the past. It's like Subhash Chandra Bose, for example. Subhash Chandra Bose did not commit war atrocities like Stepan Bandera did. Stepan Bandera got his own hands dirty. But there is a much more problematic issue of the Azov Battalion. And the Azov Battalion is basically this, it models itself on the SS. Its logo is a mangling of the SS logo. Somewhere between, depending on who you read, between 9, 10 to 13,000 people, militia, armed, violent militia, white supremacist, openly Nazi, who give the Nazi salute, who believe that the Germans did the right thing to the Russians, who were absorbed into the regular units of the Ukrainian military. So there is a very, very serious revival of Nazi movements glorifying Hitler and glorifying the Nazis west of Ukraine, in Western Ukraine, that's west of the Dnieper, which Zelensky has never condemned, which he has accepted as part and parcel of his coalition. And he has not only not condemned them, he's never acted against them. He has never tried to tamper them down. He has never even tried to tamper down any of the things they display, because it suits his narrative perfectly well. He uses them as and when required. So I would say that Zelensky may, by birth, be a Jew, but in private, he's in policy, in practice, he's more than happy to use any, including Nazi movements, to further his political career. On to the talks now. I think Zelensky really has not many options left. So yes, I do remember I predicted that by Friday, Russian troops will be in Kiev. Russian troops were in Kiev on Friday. They haven't managed to take Kiev yet. Yeah, because they are now bringing in the heavy troops. So far, all they brought in was the light armor. Now they're bringing in all the infantry and the heavy armor out there. Ukraine simply can't hold out. Is it going to be extremely bloody and nasty? Yes. But there is no way that these people can hold out. Also, this particular invasion has been much, much more rapid than Hitler's invasion of Ukraine under Operation Barbarossa. It's been much more rapid than the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. It's been, by all estimates, quite a spectacular success. Is the resistance strong? Yes. The issue always comes down to how does a country, you can be extremely valiant. The valiance and the bravery of the Ukrainian soldier is not in question. But definitely it's glorious futility. I think all heroes should be saluted. But in this case, it's I can only think that this resistance is going to get into possibly an insurgency phase after the Russian takeover, which is imminent. Even if it takes 3-4 months, this is now a situation from which Putin simply will not withdraw. If he does withdraw, it will be because of the peace talks happening right now, which is number one, for Ukraine to accept all the land seizures of Russia as legal and hand it over legally to Russia, not stake any claim to it. Two, to demilitarize and promise never to join NATO. I think the longer the talks go on, the more Putin's demands are going to keep getting maximalist. And I suspect it's going to get a lot nastier. One of the main reason that they've not been able to get into capture Kiev full time is because they're going out of their way to prevent civilian casualties. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, are doing everything to maximize civilian casualties. If you remember, Shivaji, who knew exactly how Aurangzeb was, never subjected his population to the tortures and depredations of Aurangzeb. He fought a guerrilla warfare entirely from the countryside. Zelensky wants to use his people as human shields. He's basically waiting for them, waiting for the Russians in the cities, in the hope the Russians will come in and kill as many people as possible and score huge PR points. I think that's a particularly cynical man, and I think it's absolutely despicable using your own population as human shields. It's a different argument that you're desperate and you're willing to do anything, but these are the kind of tactics you expect from jihadis in Iraq, jihadis in Chechnya. You don't expect this from an army that doesn't care about its own people and wants to expose its own people to damage. I suspect the talks, maybe the first few rounds will fail, and the nastier it gets, possibly the greater chances of success. And finally, your last question, Dr. Swami, on India-China relations. The problem with the sanctions right now is that it's pushed Russia irrevocably into Chinese orbit. And for us who are a continental power, we're not an offshore balancer, that's our nightmare come true. It's Russia so completely dependent on China today that we're looking at complete and total encirclement. China to the east, Russia and Russia's puppets to the north, Chinese puppet to our west, Chinese dependencies to our south and southeast and in the ocean below us. For us, this may be good or bad for Russia, I don't care. I'm only concerned about what's good for India. But for us, it is a nightmare come true.